guys, so I'm here today to do my end of month reading wrap up for October. Oh gosh. Again, this month I didn't do a mid-month wrap up. I read a little bit more recreationally this month than I did the month before, but I still had some work reading that carried on from September, which kind of took up a lot of my reading time, and therefore I just didn't necessarily read enough to do a mid-month wrap up. But I do expect those will return in November. I also thought I'd mention, because I'm bound to get at least one question about it, and that is my hair. This is not like a permanent change. This is a wash in, wash out hair dye. I was trying to get an idea of what I would look like with slightly darker hair, closer to my natural hair colour, and this was a golden blonde, but it's actually come out a little bit darker and a little bit ashier, which is the thing that struck me the most. My natural hair colour is definitely more red toned than this, but you know, it's just nice to get a feel for it, because I am thinking of stopping bleaching my hair, so I'm just a bit impatient and wanted to know what would I look like if I stopped bleaching my hair. And I guess this gives me a semblance of an idea, although not an exact one, so it probably won't be around for very many videos, but I'll try and enjoy it whilst I have it. But yeah, that's your very important hair update that I know you were all wondering about. And now let's get into the books. So I'm just checking on Goodreads what I have actually read this month. Okay, so first up I read Hurst by Michelle Paver. This is a bit of a gothic historical mystery novel. We start the story off in one time when a journalist is researching what went on in this house where the father appeared to go mad and run off with an axe and murder a stranger in the street. And although the father admitted to the crime, nobody really understood why it happened, and his only surviving relative is his daughter, who lived with him in the build-up to whatever happened. And this journalist has her own suspicions of what happened and is trying to get answers from the daughter, who's now an older woman. And we then flash back and are told the story from the perspective of the daughter. So we go right back to her childhood and then through her teenage years, growing up in what is quite a dark, reclusive, unloving household. Her father is not a very nice person. He does not show her any affection or have much respect for her, and she is essentially alone in the world. And while she's trying to find her own place and her own interests and do as much as she can as she's allowed as a woman in this society, we witness her father become more and more obsessed with these religious texts and artifacts that he himself is researching. And the book flips back and forwards between our protagonist's narration and diary entries from her father that she herself is reading. So we all have the same information and we're piecing things together as the book goes on. It was perfect for this kind of time of year. It was exactly what I wanted. I was really in the mood for something a little bit creepy. I think if you like books like The 13th Tale or Melmoth, although I think those books are set in different time periods, I think they have something in common, or at least I feel like Hurst had elements of both of those stories in it. So that's the kind of person I would recommend it to. And yeah, I think it was interesting, it was creepy, it ticked the boxes of what I wanted it to be, and I will probably read more Michelle Paver in the future. I then listened to a non-fiction book on audiobook, and that is Superior, The Return of Race Science by Angela Saini. So Angela Saini also has a book called Inferior, which is all about the history of gender science and the attempt by scientists and people with political motivations to prove that men and women are scientifically different and are capable of different things. You know, women are scientifically inferior, as the title suggests. But we're not talking about inferior. I did talk about that when I listened to that one as well. We're talking about superior, which takes a similar approach to science and history and the history of science, but in regard to race. And it discusses the way that race categories were essentially invented by scientists to distinguish between groups of people and create a hierarchy and prove that one is superior to the other. The book naturally therefore involves discussions of eugenics, slavery in America, Hitler Germany, all of those kind of time periods, and the progression of how these ideas have risen and fallen back down and risen again and had popularity within science despite no real scientific evidence. It's one of those cases again of, you can't quite prove us to be wrong, so my theory stands even though I have no real proof myself. And the way that those, again with political motivations, have then attempted to use that science to, you know, perhaps propagate white supremacy, for example, although it does map the history of this phenomenon across the world and throughout time. And I really like Angela Saini's approach to scientific non-fiction as somebody who doesn't know that much about science, who isn't a scientist, because I think the historical side of it, you know, gives it that balance for me. It makes it easier to follow because we like go through the progression and development of these theories over time, which again really helps, and I think they're just written in a really accessible way, and also the relevance of the subjects really comes through throughout the books, and I think they're incredible. I think Superior gives you a lot of food for thought, a better understanding of the history of race, and equally the kind of arguments and the understanding to discuss these topics and fight against the rise of race science again in the 21st century, because there are certainly those that would still like to argue that one race is superior to another or vice versa. So all in all, I think her books are very relevant and very important, and again, like I said, really accessible, which I think is why they're so important, because they can make these topics accessible to a wider audience. And I love the audiobook. She narrates it, and I always appreciate when an author narrates their own audiobook. I think it just gives something extra to it. I then also listened to the audiobook of Charlie Bone and the Blue Boa, which is book 3 in Jenny Nemo's Charlie Bone series, a middle grade fantasy novel series that came out in the early 2000s, and I myself read as a child, although I never got past book 5 because they continued to come out and I got a little bit older. I got into the stage in my life where I wasn't reading so much, so I never completed the series, and that's something I'm trying to do now. I went back to the beginning, I listened to books 1, 2 and 3 on audiobook from my library and thoroughly enjoyed them. In fact, I think The Blue Boa has been my favourite so far. I don't know if it's just because I'm really in a middle grade mood at the moment. I've been drawn to picking up a lot of middle grade recently. I'm currently reading more middle grade, so obviously I'm in the right headspace for it. But equally, there was just something about this book in particular where I felt like threads started to come together, as well as like set up for future novels started to be put in place, and I thought it was just like a great example of the series. There was some excellent character development and relationship development. I'm currently listening to an almost finished book 4, The Castle of Mirrors, but I'll save that for my next wrap up, because I do still have an hour left in the audiobook, so I'm not technically finished it. And again, I just feel like things are developing really well over the books. But yeah, so far Blue Boa has been my favourite of the 3 that I've read as an adult. Can't remember what my favourite was as a child, but I'm really enjoying returning to this world. We follow Charlie Bone, who's an endowed child, so he has a special magical ability. What he can do is he can listen to conversations between people in photographs. So if he looks at a photograph and say, me and you are in this photograph, he could hear what me and you were saying to each other when this photograph was taken, for example. And he then gets sent to this school for gifted children. Now the school itself isn't solely a magical school, so most children at the school don't have endowments. They're either skilled in drama, art or music, and those are the 3 departments, or they're one of a small group of children who have these magical abilities. And then amongst them we have like a hypnotist, someone that can control the weather, someone that can talk to animals, someone that can experience memories and emotions through touch and clothing, and lots of different exciting endowments. It is such a magical series, although it's also one of those middle grade series that definitely falls under the bracket of useless parents. Like, the children just get up to the most ridiculous things in these books, despite the fact that their parents are around. Like they don't board over the weekends, they have summer holidays, they go home to visit their parents, yet their parents are just so like absent, really. I mean, they crop up, but they don't seem to stop the children from doing ridiculous things. But it's middle grade, you kind of just have to go with that. That's what makes it fun. It's fantasy, it's unrealistic, but it's still a compelling story. So yeah, I really enjoyed The Blue Boa. Obviously I can't say too much about the plot of that specific book because it would give spoilers away for books 1 and 2, but just know that it's my favourite so far and I will be continuing to read the series. From the library I borrowed the first volume of the Faith comic book series, which binds up issues 1 to 4, and this is a superhero comic book series, which is not my genre of comic book or graphic novel. Like, I am not a superhero person. I don't really like the Avengers film, although, caveat, I do love Guardians of the Galaxy and X-Men, but I'm not somebody that just naturally gravitates towards anything superhero themed, and I've tried to read superhero comic books in the past and just find them a little bit overwhelming, because they're often set in these multiverses where you have to know so much. And I assumed, perhaps foolishly, that Faith being the first volume in a series would be a fun in, and it's also a little bit unique because Faith is a plus size superhero, which isn't common, particularly among female superheroes. So I liked that concept. I liked that the representation was more diverse than your regular comic book superheroes, and because it was the first volume, I thought it would be a fun in. However, I still felt lost. I didn't quite realise that Faith had a background of being involved in her own like superhero gang when she was younger, and this book is picking up later in her story when she's not part of that gang anymore. And although I felt like the book was trying to be accessible, I also just felt like there was a lot of discussion of things that I did not understand or know where they were coming from or get the context of, so I still felt a little bit lost in this world. I didn't hate it though. I gave it 3 stars. I still thought it was like a solid storyline, and I might read the second volume, although I will not be buying it. I would 100% borrow it from my library if they have it. I don't know if they have, but also if I don't read it, I'm not going to be fussed. Like, it's not something that's in any way high priority for me or a story that I must know more of. It would just be a kind of like, hey, if it's around, why not? It's a quick read if I do pick it up, if that makes sense. I'm sure you get what I mean. There's just some books like that. But yeah, I just felt a bit lost, and I haven't had any love of superhero comics sparked from the experience. Although I will say that I still did very much appreciate the plus size representation and Faith's characterisation. I really liked her as a person and a character. So then I read another book from the library, which was Overheard in the Tower Block by Joseph Colo, which is a collection of middle grade poetry, so children's poetry, and I loved this collection. I love children's poetry, partly because I read a lot of poetry as a child, so I have such fond memories of children's poetry. Like, it was such a big part of my reading as a child. I think it was a big part of my love of reading as a child, and why I continue to read poetry as an adult, and what made it more accessible to me and less intimidating to me. And I continue to enjoy a little bit of children's poetry every now and again. Not only because it can be very like fun and full of levity and like happiness and a little bit silly on occasion, but equally it can deal with serious topics. And Overheard in the Tower Block is certainly on that side of the spectrum. It is a children's poetry collection that still deals with serious topics. Most of the poems are told from the perspective of a young boy growing up in a London tower block, and it covers all aspects of his life, from listening to his parents arguing, from playing with the other kids on his estate, from not understanding why his dad leaves them, to going to school and exploring the library. The ups and the downs. I think it's like a really accurate portrayal of childhood that isn't this perfect blissful experience always, and therefore why shouldn't children's literature help children explore those issues and those experiences? And I think poetry is an excellent vehicle for that, and I think this poetry collection in particular is just really beautifully written and has lots of layers to it, but can equally be appreciated on the surface level but can equally be appreciated on quite a surface level. So yeah, really enjoyed that. We'll probably read more by this author in the future. I then read 2 more books which were actually part of my reading the lowest rated books on my TBR video, which I did a whole video for. I picked the 3 lowest rated books on my TBR, read them throughout the course of the video, vlogged the experience, and wrapped up and reviewed them at the end, although I did DNF one. If you want to know more about that, you can go watch that video. But the 2 I did finish were Gingerbread by Helen Oyeyemi and Troilus and Cressida by William Shakespeare. I won't dwell on them too much because, like I said, I talked a lot about them in that video, but briefly, Gingerbread is a magic realism novel set in 21st century London, but flashing back to the childhood of one of our protagonists, who's a single mother, Harriet, living in London with her daughter Perdita and her mother, whose name I can't remember right now, and she and her mother grew up in a country which nobody else believes exists. So everybody else is in complete denial this country even exists, although we know it does because she came from there, but her daughter's never been there. And her daughter's fascinated by it. So we then listen to Harriet tell her daughter about her childhood growing up in this place and how she came to England with her mother. It is a very surreal book, so it is not for everyone, but it's also beautifully written and full of really interesting themes. I then also, like I mentioned, finished Troilus and Cressida by William Shakespeare, which was just a sort of middle of the road Shakespeare for me. It's based on Greek mythology, it's set during the Trojan War, and is supposed to follow 2 Trojans, Troilus and Cressida, as they fall in love, but actually spends way more time focused on the Greeks and the Trojans in their respective camps and like well, fortified cities discussing the war, and that is not really what I wanted from it, and I think the tone's a little bit all over the place. However, when it was good, it was really good. There was some really funny moments, but it's not a comedy, so then the rest of the time it just felt a little bit stale, and I didn't actually find it that upsetting or tragic, but maybe that's because I have read a lot about the Trojan War and this just wasn't the best retelling, so it was okay. I won't be reading it again. But those are all the books that I read in October. I would love to hear your thoughts if you have read or are interested in reading any of these books. And equally, I'm always interested in learning about the books that you've read in the month and what you've enjoyed. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you again soon. Bye guys!